Hey, hi, welcome. My name is Natalie Garcia, and this is my 2023 Spring Showcase. I am a KDP member and an Honor Society member. I am also an early childhood education major, and my research is translanguaging in preschool strategies to promote students' full linguistic repertoire. So for some context and rationale, I am in Addison Early Learning Center in a pre-K one-way dual language program. We follow a 90-10 model. So 90% of the day is in Spanish and 10% is in English. A little bit more of background about the school. 48% are low-income students, 46% are students with IEPs, and 61% are English learners. The two focal students that I chose to do my research on, one was identified as English dominant and the other was identified as Spanish dominant. My Spanish dominant speaker, originally Spanish dominant, now speaks mostly English within the classroom or has better command of English than Spanish now. So some of the questions that I was asking when conducting my research or beginning my research was, what is translanguaging? How do my students communicate what they know and what they've learned? And what languages do they use? My researcher questions for my teacher researcher question, it was, how can I as a teacher researcher promote and model translanguaging with my preschool dual language learners? And my student question was, how can dual language preschoolers utilize new vocabulary when translanguaging? The conceptual framework that really did frame my research was this idea or this concept of translanguaging. Translanguaging is one's use of their full linguistic repertoire, or the deployment of a speaker's full linguistic repertoire without regard for watchful adherence to the socially and politically defined boundaries of named and usually national and state languages. Its focuses on the idea that language is intertwined and does not work as two separate languages. So it challenges the idea that bilingualism or multilingualism and bilingualism is often accepted as a double monolingualism. Also, it challenges that idea that it's two separate things within a bilingual brain, and really it does work as something that is intertwined. Translanguaging is then seen as a sustainable practice by bilingual speakers to thrive in, spatial and functional interrelation with the sustaining linguistic practices of speakers. On top of translanguaging, I utilize total physical response in my teaching of vocabulary, and total physical response is using one's body when teaching or learning new concepts. The data collection and analysis tools for my researcher question, I utilized 3 data sources. The first one was audio recordings, the second one was anecdotal notes, and the third was reflections. For my student research question, the first one was audio recordings, the second one was video recordings, and the third one was checklist and work or artifacts. The data collection spanned a total of 10 days with field notes, audio recordings, and images and pictures, either every other day or every day. The codes I will be using for my transcripts of the audio recordings are here. The green is interactions between peers, IEP. The pink is interaction between student and adult, or ISA. And the yellow is teacher modeling translanguaging, MT. So some of the findings between students, translanguaging between peers, and understanding in spoken language. I found that peers are able to communicate each using 2 different languages as long as they're able to receptively understand each other's language. This one was particularly interesting and it really did put into very solid understanding of how language works within a dual language program and the interactions. So although my English dominant and my Spanish dominant spoke 2 different languages or had better command of one or the other, they were still able to communicate. One translanguaged a bit more and used, or one utilized both Spanish and English a bit more than my English dominant speaker, and they were able to communicate in that matter. But it was interesting how they navigated the language. And it didn't really matter which language they were dominant in. They were both both my focal students were um, a preferred peer in the classroom, so they did prefer to spend time with each other and were friends. So it did not matter that they had one language that dominated the other. They were still able to understand and interact in both an academic setting and a social context. My Spanish dominant student N used both languages to explain something to a peer. So we really see translanguaging in effect and how she processes and understands language. When explaining to my English dominant student C, she asked her, "Do you know what a vomit is?" And my English dominant speaker said no. And then she explained it to her in Spanish, or translated it for her. A vomit is a vomitar, although it is vomitar. So you really see my student translanguaging and trying to clarify a concept to her peer. Student C continued to use her dominant language with peers and showed an understanding in another language. And she also set certain expectations, which I will get into later. So here we see another student who was Spanish dominant, attempting to interact with my English dominant speaker, and I facilitated that contact or that communication. There was almost kind of a resistance or hesitancy for her to respond to my Spanish dominant speaker. So I cued her, or I prompted her, or reminded her that she is being spoken to. So she did respond in English, and what I noticed about my English dominant speaker is she sets almost this expectation, where she knows that if people understand her in English, she'll communicate, or she's more open to communicating with her. But this is an infrequent interaction between the two. And then for findings, how students use their full linguistic repertoire when interacting with adults. Student My English dominant or my Spanish dominant speaker student and translanguage with an adult that spoke both languages. So with me, when I asked her what she was making, or she said that she's making a house, and she mentioned that I needed a puerta, doors, paredes. So she utilized her full linguistic repertoire, utilized both languages to navigate that. And my other student spoke both English with both adults, with me and my paraprofessional who was Spanish dominant. So she says, it's really interesting how my English dominant speaker student or student C sets kind of has this expectation that others, as long as they respond to her, they understand her, and she'll continue to use English because she understands Spanish. So there's not that need again for a same language being utilized. So students' understanding of not needing to speak the same language is reinforced with the use of me as a teacher and other adults speaking her dominant language, which is a paraprofessional. I did try to model Spanish. For example, here my Spanish dominant student N said maestra, which is how she refers to me in Spanish. We switched paintings, say, oh, intercambiaron pintura. But she navigates her communication with my paraprofessional very differently. She responds to her in Spanish and speaks to her in Spanish. So if there was a mutual understanding, there was not needed for a common language, but my student who kind of had equal control of both languages, or a good understanding and the same use of both languages, was able to navigate them much more fluently and use them with different peers and different adults. And when trying to elicit and promote Spanish, I found that there are different ways to show their knowledge in Spanish and students reasoning for using each language. And there was also an academic understanding of numbers and letters in Spanish. In this instance, when I asked my Spanish dominant speaker what letters she was looking at, she responded to me in Spanish. And over here, when I ask my students what they know with what they speak in Spanish, or what they know in Spanish, or why they speak in Spanish, they gave me an example of Spanish with numbers, with counting numbers. which I thought it was which was another finding I found interesting, that their academic understanding of numbers and letters was in Spanish, and that's how they showed to me that they knew Spanish, or when they know something, they kind of associate that with Spanish. Over here too, when I explicitly asked my originally Spanish dominant speaker, who she speaks Spanish with, which was with everybody and her cousins, but why she didn't speak Spanish with my other focal student, my English dominant speaker. And she responded with, yeah, because she wants to tell me English. So she's here telling us that, or explaining why she speaks one language or the other. And here's because she understands that since once the student wants to talk to her in English, she's going to respond to her in English. And over here, we see an exchange of me asking what they know in English and how comfortable they are in using Spanish. And here we see them learning from each other. And how do you say phone in Spanish? Or and naming things that they know in Spanish. And when they reach something that they don't know, they ask, how are they doing? So that was a nice facilitation between peers for them to learn from each other. And for eliciting and promoting Spanish, I did prompt students or encourage them to transfer their knowledge from English to Spanish, especially my English dominant speaker. And I noticed the positive outcomes were achieved. And by that, I mean that there was an effort. And asking students to say it in Espanol, or if they were talking to me in English, I would be like, in Espanol, requesting for them to ask them to talk to me in Spanish with a total physical response to prompt that or elicit that language to transfer more efficiently. So here we are doing TPR movements with new vocabulary. And over here, we are at the easel. ¿Qué vas a pintar? ¿Vas a pintar una casa? Oh, a casa. ¿Y qué colores vas a usar? ¿Y qué necesita una casa? Necesita ¿cómo es? Un techo. Y una en español. Una puerta y windows. Y en español. Here I was prompting my student with total physical response movements and asking her to transfer her knowledge from English to Spanish, which was successful with a little bit of prompting. So she shows me that she does know the parts of a building and she is learning these things, but to take it a step further is to transfer it in English or in Spanish. I apologize. Then implications. When working with dual language learners, it is important to understand their linguistic backgrounds and repertoire to further support their growth in a dual language program. Conversations and interviews to understand students and the way in which they navigate language is important in ensuring that as teachers, we understand their perspective on communication. Even my preschoolers who are 3 to 5-year-olds, both of my focal students are 4 turning 5, were able to explicitly state why they speak a certain language or why they navigate language in that manner. So that's extremely important to sit down and really get to know your students and ask that. Preserving a language and supporting the continuing development of the first language and supporting transfer into a second language, I find is important in maintaining this idea of promoting biliteracy, not only bilingualism, but biliteracy and academic achievement in both languages, and being able to transfer what one knows into another language. And it is important to communicate with a diverse classroom and varying strengths and needs. A shared spoken language is not necessary, rather an understanding of the other is. These are my references. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of the showcase, and thank you to my professors as well for their support.